While the possible psychotherapy of the primary psychosis should aim at reducing the activity of the consciousness in its focal point, the psychotic external self-esteem, the prevention and psychotherapy of anxiety disorders in non-psychotic people should aim at desensitization in the hyperactivity point of consciousness, anxiety, emotional alertness point. Both the first and the second task are extremely difficult, on the verge of feasibility, especially regarding the possibility of psychotherapeutic correction of psychosis in the external self-esteem focal point. Let's not forget that we are dealing with a psychosis of the paranoid type. That's a type of psychosis without any, even the slightest sense of a mental disorder, with the absence of the so-called problem insight. Due in particular to this zero insight, the psychotherapy of such people makes no sense. It's quite different with the psychotherapy of the anxiety, emotional alertness point, consciousness, hyperactivity point. Here, the insight or understanding of an existing disorder by the patient is almost always present, and this therapeutic work, admittedly, many years of work, makes sense. Yes, the work is long because reducing the hyperactivity of consciousness in the anxiety emotional alertness point is extremely difficult to achieve. But, of course, in the case of a competent therapist and of a patient involvement in the therapeutic process, it's possible and advisable. In general, any prevention and psychotherapy of anxiety disorders, including depressive disorders, as I have already mentioned many times, should aim to educate and develop those characteristics of the psyche which are atrophic in the non-psychotic people and which are hypertrophic in the people with the primary psychosis, and vice versa. And so, it's necessary in the type 2 humanity people to emphasize and strengthen the point of consciousness related to the external self-esteem, a point of little activity, especially in the progressive anxiety disorder and depression. The activity of the self-critical apparatus should then be lowered. It's also necessary to loosen the cohesiveness of the logical system so that it becomes more naive, childish, and stereotypical, following the example of people with the primary psychosis. The system of magical thinking, characteristic of the primary psychosis, should also be supported. It's also important to support the trivialization of thought processes in the reduction of mental creativity. Finally, it's imperative for the emotional processes to be as shallow as possible. So, the therapy should aim to reduce the depth of emotional feelings. As we can see, from a mental point of view, the type 1 humanity psyche appears to present a more favorable form of functioning than the type 2 humanity psyche. To put it in simple terms, the life of type 1 humanity people is much, much easier than that of type 2 humanity people. The type 1 humanity people are confident decision making, apparently decision making, because their decisions are, however, uh, in a much degree suggested by in the environment. People who do not hesitate in making decisions, the way I explained, are not tormented by the remorses of consciousness afterwards. They are people who do not know the feeling of anxiety, and also only in a very narrow range, the one of emotions. So they seem deliberate, selfish, cold, and ruthless. But this is not entirely true. In order for them to be deliberate, they would need a sophisticated system of logic and creativity. Meanwhile, their rigid psyche does not allow them to develop either the one or the other. On the contrary, they always show childishness and routine in their behavior and thinking. It's true, however, that having a flattened emotionality, they are incapable of either exuberance or spontaneity. The latter is also due to the mental rigidity. And finally, the most important thing to say about the type 1 humanity psyche is the self worship and the lack of self distance, as well as the tendency to feel resentment and offense, exceeding all interpersonal norms, as soon as this self worship is not shared by the environment. This is the most noticeable feature, but only after a bit longer acquaintance. In its early but short stage, the Type 1 humanity people are unmatched masters of attracting attention and sympathy. This question, the question is naturally legitimate of whether the childhood means necessarily the primary psychosis for all children. Very good question. Whether all children have primary psychosis. And the answer is yes. Actually, yes. As a result of the psychoevolution, in order to ensure a peaceful mental development and to protect a very young psyche against the anxiety pole, the child's consciousness remains under the umbrella of the primary psychosis. When does this psychosis begin? As soon as the seed of consciousness is formed. The anxiety pole of the psyche is formed before the consciousness, according to the principle that the evolutionarily older traits in individual development appear before younger ones. Almost immediately after the activation of the most primitive form of consciousness, probably in part of the population still in the prenatal period, but in the majority of the population at various times after birth, the umbrella of the primary psychosis stretches over the child's consciousness. It is necessary for the child's psyche to develop calmly and harmoniously, not disturbed by anxiety stimuli coming from the anxiety pole of the psyche. Of course, as it happens with natural processes, they function almost always flawlessly, but unfortunately not always. But in the development of a child, newborn, and infant, there are rarely, but still cases in which, after the activation of the consciousness, despite the passage of consecutive days, weeks, or even months, the umbrella of the primary psychosis, unfortunately, does not start to protect the child's germinating consciousness. It continues to be attacked by the anxiety stimuli from the anxiety pole. This is, of course, a development disaster in the child's psyche, causing an irreparable damage to the consciousness formation. Thank you.